Hi, this is Mark Arnold with another Fun Ideas podcast, and today I have an author. His name is James Campion. Uh, uh, he's written a few books, one about Kiss, one about Warren Zevon, a few other books we'll talk about. And his current book is called "Take a Sad Song: Emotional Currency of Hey Jude." And so I want to welcome you to the show. How are you doing today?
Thank you very much for having me, Mark. I really appreciate it. Yes, I'm doing well. Yourself?
Yes, I'm doing well too. I had a little bit of an illness earlier this week, and I was saying, I hope I can do this, but I
Oh, I'm
actually feel
sorry.
pretty good right now.
Good.
Just
Good.
just a cold, fortunately. But anyway,
Oh, yeah, these days you have to be careful. Yeah.
yes. I want to talk about the current book first because that's the whole purpose of having you on here.
Oh, thank you.
Hey Jude is a very good Beatles song. I'll just agree with you right there. But as a subject of a book, it's kind of interesting. I'm a huge Beatle fan, so I can kind of go like, what were you thinking? Because it's like I've seen people do like books about a particular album, like with the White Album, which is probably the closest album to Hey Jude, even though it's not even on the album, or even a grouping of songs or something like that. But to tackle just one song going all the way through and in all the different angles and ways that you do, which I've written notes here on how you've done that. Why?
That's a fair question because I'm nuts. Well, the first answer to that is I'm now I think I looked it up, the 10th or 11th author to write a book about one song. So it has been done. And I got to know quite a few of these authors during the process of working on this book, which is very nice. A good friend of mine, Alan Light, wrote a book called "The Holy and the Broken" about Hallelujah, the Leonard Cohen song. Grail Marcus, the great dean of music critics and a wonderful author in his own right, many great books, wrote a book called Like a Rolling Stone, Bob Dylan at the Crossroads, which is a huge influence on a few of my writings. I got to know Grail during the writing of this book. And there's a wonderful book written about White Christmas. Dave Marsh wrote a book about Louie Louie. So there's quite a few out there. And it was an inspiration for me. I got the idea initially, and I don't think I've ever mentioned this in other interviews I've done, but when I wrote my last book, Accidentally Like a Martyr, The Tortured Art of Warren Zevon, I wrote 9 essays about single songs and then 3 essays about 3 seminal albums from his career. And I was able to have a narrative arc of his career as an artist and a man. And I thought that was unique. And my good friend Stephen Hayden has just done the same thing with Pearl Jam. And he and I spoke about that prior to when the book came out. And it's a wonderful book. I just finished it. And so what I thought was, I wonder if I could do this for a full song. And when I read those other gentlemen's works, I thought I can. But what song? And the reason why I picked Hey Jude, to answer the second part of why, is it was my earliest sentient memory as a child, singing the na-nas to help me fall asleep before I even knew anything about the Beatles or anything about Hey Jude or Paul McCartney or anything. So that always kind of stuck with me. And when I started writing down notes to do the book idea, I started discovering more and more things about Hey Jude that are so deep and so long in the grand history of the Beatles that it begged me almost to extend the story. I originally signed with Backbeat Books to do a 60,000 word book. And I ended up doing 80,000 words because this damn song had so much to it. And it inspired me. And I was very lucky to interview so many great, learned and smart people about it. And they helped me along the way to discover how great this song is, how great the Beatles are, how great a songwriter Paul McCartney is, and all the wonderful relationships and everything about the year 1968. It really all blossomed from there.
Well, that's very good. All right, we're done.
That's my why.
No, but I will
Sorry
say
for the
this.
long answer. Yeah.
I will say this about Hey Jude, and it is it's not my favorite Beatles song, but it's up there. It's one of the top ones. I was thinking, if you're going to pick a song to work on and really deep dive and really dissect it like the way you have, it's a good one because it's not just a bit of fluff that McCartney just dashed off, in his sleep or something like some of his songs can be, I suppose. like, I don't know if you could write such an in-depth thing about, say, the song Get Back. No, I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad song, but I mean,
Understood.
in the case of Hey Jude, it's written about a real life event, a real life person, being Julian Lennon,
Right.
and in a lesser sense, John and Yoko. And
Mhm.
in the case of Julian Lennon, he even has a current album named Jude that he just put out in
Yep.
reference to this song. So um, obviously it resonates for them and everyone else. And I've heard the history before, and you discussed it a little bit in the book too, of where um McCartney's coming up with the lines. Lennon is enthralled, and he says, the movement you need is on your shoulder. And he goes, I'll get rid of that one. And he goes, no, that's the best one in there. Keep that in, that
Yeah.
type of thing. Those little tidbits. So there's quite a bit to that has already been, revealed,
Hmm.
about the song. So you basically expanded upon it to
Yeah. Yeah.
ad nauseum in a certain regard, and actually did a pretty good job considering, I did like the way you did, is like you kind of talk about the song, then you go, let's talk about Beatle history, and then talk about the song. Oh, let's talk about how McCartney's writing style is. Talk about the song. Talk about what was going on in 1968. Talk about the song. The
Thank
back
you.
and forth. It
I
wasn't just
appreciate that. Yeah.
all Hey Jude, da 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 da. yeah,
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. And even something like the line, the movement you need is on your shoulder.
Mhm.
I've always been fascinated, and I think the world has always been fascinated with John and Paul's relationship since teenage years. The loss of their mothers, which I read about in the book, the connection they had, the connection to their women, whom they met within, just a couple of months of each other, and then married within a week of each other in 1969, and what that song meant to John, and to the fact that until his dying day, in his last interview for Playboy, John tells the story about listening to Hey Jude for the first time and thinking that the song is about him. And of course it is. And it's
Mhm.
about Paul, and it's about Linda, it's about Yoko, it's about Julian, it's about the Beatles, it's about 1968, it's about everything. And it's all in there. And I've always been moved by the fact, no pun intended, that John was so connected to that song and said that this is the greatest song that Paul ever wrote. And he always said that after that. And even Tim Riley, who was John Lennon's biographer and the great Beatle writer and professor and musicologist, said something very smart to me, and I put it in the book, that the intimacy that John and Paul had was about the art and music.
Mhm.
So it makes perfect sense, one, that John never said, and he did that with other songs, he did nothing to Hey Jude. It was perfect the second he heard it. And secondly, both of these men would go on, talk about let her under your skin, let her into your heart. You have found her, now go and get her. These two men would take these women and make them part of their art. They weren't just their wives, they weren't
Right.
just the loves of their lives, but they took these women and they, Paul put her, Linda in Wings, and John did all that performance art and music and everything with Yoko.
Mhm.
And Tim said that's the love that John had for Paul, and back and forth, and that they extended that to their women and said, if I'm going to be really in a great relationship, it
Mhm.
has to be a creative, artistic one.
Yeah.
And that, I believe that very much is in Hey Jude.
Mhm. Now, do you think? Now, I did read through the book, but it doesn't mean I memorized it. So I may ask you stuff that, it says it in there on page
Thank you. Well, thank you
86.
for reading. Well, thank you for reading it. I
uh,
appreciate that. Thank you, Bob.
but um, do you think that they were thinking in those terms themselves when they praise the song, or is this more of your take on it?
No, no,
From
John did praise the song. He praised it throughout his
okay,
career. I have 3 quotes from different parts
okay,
of his life where he said
okay,
that was Paul's best work. Of course, as a music writer and journalist and critic, I guess you can call it. I like to call myself an essayist, and I love doing research in the interviews. But
hmm,
for me, of course, there is some interpretation, because that's the beauty of art, right? Whether it's a
right,
film or a painting or a poem or certainly a song.
hmm,
But to me, I think Peter Ames Carlin, who is one of Paul's biographers, told me for the book, Paul always worked best in the subconscious. So
yeah,
when he picked things up, he was able to communicate those things.
yeah,
And I think he does it the best, in my estimation, in Hey Jude, where he absolutely is covering all the bases. He is falling in love with Linda. He is losing his friend John to Yoko, but understanding it.
Mhm.
He is comforting Julian, whom he relates to because he was a lonely child, lost his mom. He understood that John's father left him at 5, the way John was leaving his son to go with Yoko.
Mhm.
Paul's empathy that he places in songs like Eleanor Rigby,
Mhm.
or so many of his songs, his solo songs as well,
Yeah.
that he gets from his mom, who
Mhm.
was an empathetic figure, a nurse and a caregiver. And all of those things I think he puts in Hey Jude. And he puts in other songs too, like Let It Be,
Mhm.
Lady Madonna,
Yeah.
Your Mother Should Know. These are important songs to Paul. So I think if you look at the canon of the Beatles, if you see how Paul wrote and you see where the Beatles were as people, as a band, and
Mhm.
what their generation was at, I think of course, a lot of it is interpretation, but it's also research and reading the biographies. Paul has never come out and said, yeah, I wrote this song about John and Yoko. I wrote this song about Linda, but it's in there.
Yeah.
It's definitely in there.
Do you think this is Paul's most personal song, or you think
Ooh.
maybe he's gotten more personal on others? And I can name a couple if you to compare. If you
Yeah. Wow. That is a great question. I mean, obviously, he wrote a song about he and John years later.
right, I was going to mention that here today.
Here Today, which is
Um,
a gorgeous song.
I was going to
Maybe,
mention
maybe I'm amazed.
yesterday, just for the sake of
Sure.
that's possibly considered one of his greatest songs too. But
A
uh,
song, by the way, Mark, that
uh,
he said in his 40s, he is almost positive he wrote that for his mother subconsciously, because when he
that
writes
one,
why she had to go, I don't know, she wouldn't say. When Paul's mother got sick, they sent her away
yeah,
and they didn't tell the children. 1 minute she's vibrant, she's taking care of his skin knee, and the
hmm
next minute she's dying in a bed when he's 14 years old. So that was a obviously traumatic experience for Paul, and he felt that he put it in subconsciously in one of his great songs, Yesterday. I do think it's his most personal song, having spent a year with it,
hmm
but I think he has others. I mentioned Maybe I'm
yeah,
Amazed, about Linda directly,
yeah,
and some of the other songs that
yeah,
he had written. I can't think of the top of my head, but yes, I think it is one of his
yeah.
most original songs.
It's funny. I usually don't group it together, but I always think that McCartney was at his peak in 1970 with the three, even though two of them actually were recorded a year earlier, but they all came out at the same time. Let It Be, Long and Winding Road, and Maybe I'm Amazed. It's like those are
Good
like
point.
firing on all thrusters, all the
Sure as hell is.
but
Yeah.
but if you know your Get Back history and everything, obviously two of the three were at least recorded almost a year earlier. So
Right.
year and a
And I
half
think
early.
the beauty of
Yeah.
Paul, he's very underrated, Mark, in the sense where, Paul wrote When I'm 64 when he was 16.
Yeah.
It reminds me, and I've mentioned this in other interviews, Joni Mitchell wrote, you know, Both Sides Now when she was 21.
Yeah.
When she sang it in her late 60s, it was, to me, much more moving. It's a gorgeous song, one of the greatest songs ever written. I could write a book about that.
Yeah.
But she wrote from the standpoint of someone who's lived life, and she
Right.
was so young. So
Yeah.
these artists are able to put themselves in these places and
Yeah.
these mindsets and communicate well. And
Yeah.
Paul is totally underrated in my mind, as a songwriter and as a lyricist,
Right.
in that way. Yeah.
Yeah. And the one that a lot of people don't know, you'd probably know it if you're a total Paul guy and have everything he ever put out, is a more recent song called The End of the End, where, he's thinking about his own mortality and death. And
Sure.
I think he was in his 60s at the time, which is, considerably
Right.
up
Now he's
there, but
80.
not
Yeah.
now he's in his 80s. So
Yeah.
it's
He's
like,
80. Yeah.
if he wrote it now, you'd say, oh yeah, he's thinking he's going to die soon or something. But he wrote it 20 something years ago, and it's like, you know it's like, well, I don't think he's thinking he's going to die anytime soon, but the thought has crossed his mind. So
Sure.
um uh, the interesting thing about McCartney, and I don't know if you agree or not, is just that he's not like Lennon in this regard. He doesn't seem to like care too much to report on himself too much.
Yes.
He does at times, but
Right.
he does a lot of third person songs, which Lennon always kind of seemed to uh disown, although he did considerable amount of those too. you
Yes. Yeah. No,
know
you're right about that. That's one of the things that the singer songwriter, Eric Hutchinson. I interviewed songwriters,
Mhm.
professors, and writers and rock critics and biographers of Paul and the Beatles for the book. And Eric Hutchinson is a great singer-songwriter, and he's a good friend. And he was the person that pointed out to me at the very beginning, this is a second person song. He's talking to someone else. It's very original in the sense where, not that it's original, people have done it a million times, but it's original in the sense where it's not polemic. He's not preachy. You never get the feeling that you're being told, hey, you know, pick up your bootstraps, get it going, do this. No, and that's why I find it's a lineage. And some of the musicologists told me it's a lineage to She Loves You. You have one man talking to another man about a woman, but not in the way like, I'm going to get your woman and steal that woman, that kind of blues rock and roll trope. It's about you have a chance to change your life. Don't blow this. And I remember Rob Sheffield from Rolling Stone telling me, and I put it in the book, that it's very rare for two men speaking, or a man telling another man sincerely, you have a chance to find love, be vulnerable, be there for pain, let the pain in. And that's something that Paul did, and that was quite unique. But you're right, John wrote more on a personal level, and he made a concerted effort to do that after In My Life. Whereas before he wrote, Norwegian Wood, kind of a story about an affair instead of actually saying it. So, but you're right. But Paul continually told you these wonderful narratives like Eleanor Rigby, in which he takes these characters and he makes a narrative about lonely people. He makes his point that way. But then, of course, he's got those songs like We Can Work It Out and For No One, where he's kind of communicating with Jane Asher, the woman that he was with before Linda. So he does balance that beautifully. But good point. He does write more in the third and second person than John did. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And you touched on this a little bit in the book. You only mentioned a couple examples, but I wanted to mention some more. So you said if there wasn't a Hey Jude, there wouldn't be a You Can't Always Get What You Want by the Rolling Stones, or a Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen. But even within the Beatles, there are two songs that really are similar in a certain way that you didn't even touch on, and I was just kind of curious your thoughts. One is Lennon's I Want You, She's So Heavy, and George's Isn't It a Pity from his first solo album.
I do touch upon that in the book. Not I Want You. Yeah, I know that I brought it up because the famous story is that Paul did not like the answer pieces that George was playing originally when they were arranging the song. So every time he sang Hey Jude, George would go bam, down, you know what I mean? That kind of thing. And Paul didn't want it. Interestingly enough, years later, George got his revenge because he ended up doing that on Real Love. After every line, he's playing a lick. But in the case of Isn't It a Pity, George is quite, in a literal sense, sending up Hey Jude at the end, where he just takes the Hey Jude thing. In a way, he's saying, isn't it a pity, because they kind of fell apart. And George always felt like the little brother to John and Paul. And he specifically was, I don't want to use the word tortured, but pushed by Paul quite a bit during the Let It Be sessions, even in the Get Back revisionist idea of, hey, these guys still love each other and played well together, which I think we all believed, even seeing Let It Be, that George felt a little bit more angst towards Paul. I mean, clearly he did, because he played with John afterwards. He even played on How Do You Sleep, where John is mocking Paul. So there's an idea that George had a little bit of a beef there. So he puts that it is in the pity. That's a great point about I Want You, which of course comes later after Hey Jude. I do fail to mention that, but I interviewed a lot of professors that talked about the songs like Layla, in which you have one part of the song that's this, and then the ending part that's a completely different thing, which is what Hey Jude is. And in the sense of Hey Jude, where the na-na part is longer than the structured song, which is crazy. But yes, I think it was Eric again who mentions You Can't Always Get What You Want. A couple of people mentioned Bohemian Rhapsody. One of the things I found out is that the same piano that Paul plays on Hey Jude, because it was at Trident Studios, Freddie Mercury played for Bohemian Rhapsody.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
It's a nice little connection. Yeah.
There we go. We learned something here.
There you go.
Another one I didn't mention also, and it's only interesting because Lennon once said, of course, Lennon always contradicted himself, but he always said, if I could write like TV commercials, that would be the thing to do if I could keep it short and simple. But it seemed like once Paul did Hey Jude, it gave Lennon a little more freedom to actually, and the other one that came to mind was his version of God, because it kind of starts off, it's a two-parter as well. It doesn't have a na part, but it has the first part about God, and then the second part is just what he no longer believes, over and over in kind of a repetitive tone.
That's excellent. That's an excellent example of that. Yes. And, it's funny about that. One of the things that I learned when the White Album came out during my working of the book, the box set, and they had that take 18 of Revolution that was recorded on May 30th, one of the first takes, and it goes on for 9-10 minutes. And John is screaming at the end, much like Paul does at the end of Hey Jude. And I almost feel like, and it's ironic that the upbeat or the single version of Revolution is on the B side of Hey Jude. When they worked on Revolution, Paul's right in there with him, banging on the piano while John's screaming, all right, he's really getting into it. And I find that gave license to Paul to do a very long version, because, you got the first part, which is, you say you want a revolution, and then you got the end part, which is just a basic vamp, which Hey Jude is on the all right, instead of na-nas. So it's great. Those guys were so competitive, but so influential and inspirational for each other. So it's all right there. Yeah.
Although they can tend to do it in a good way, but I was saying they can also do it in the wrong way, like what's the new Mary Jane?
Oh my God!
And even Revolution #9 has its critics, because of it just kind of goes on, and it's not really a comprehensible song, but
I love Revolution 9. I always did, even as a kid. The White Album's my favorite Beatle album, but what's the okay, cool. What's the new Mary Jane is awful. It's always been awful. It drives me nuts. I hate it. It's awful. I had it on a bootleg in high school, and I just couldn't even believe it. I'm like, what is happening? And you're right, it goes on for ever.
My favorite part of it, though, is where he says, "Let's hear it before they take us away," and it cuts off before he even says the whole away. Anyway. But it's like it got to be the point where it's like they're gonna record it, and that was the year '68 was when Lennon started doing all those albums with Yoko, where Baby's Heartbeat, 2 Minutes Silence, really or even George with Electronic Sound, just the indulgence there. How much will these Beatle fans tolerate here?
Right, which is funny because that's all comes from Apple or the letter Zapple and all these different things. And Hey Jude is the first single released by Apple, and that's one of those great statistics that I talk about early in the book that Hey Jude has, and that is it's the largest selling single ever released by an initial label. So, let's say like if Sun Records came out, or Chess Records or Columbia Records, no other record company had released their initial single that sold that much. Now, of course, this is the Beatles, right? But it is Hey Jude. And I talk about this too. 68 is very important, but also they did the video, right? So, and I interviewed Michael Lindsay Hogg, who directed Let It Be, but he directed that video, and he and I speak, and that was one of my favorite chapters to write about, because when he created that, in a sense, it was a way for the people who had not seen the Beatles play together since 1966. And that's people who bought tickets to go to San Francisco or to the concerts, but on TV. Think about that. The Beatles had not been on television to play together probably since 65. So it had been like 3 years since anybody saw the Beatles. So to see them together and singing a song about togetherness, well, that was a big deal. And that, helped sell that record worldwide. It was also it was #1 in more countries worldwide than any other Beatles song, and I think for decades than any other song ever released.
It's kind of interesting, to think about that, because I always think of the what's the word I'm trying to think, is that the Beatles were constantly progressing, or some may argue that it was a peak with Sgt. Pepper and then everything else after that was downhill. I won't say that, but in a certain respect, this it was the peak, and everything after was downhill. In a certain respect, I can't say.
That's very good. Yes, no, again, it's funny. I touch upon that book. I'm so glad you said that, because I don't want to. I'm not going to die on that hill. But for the purposes of argument, and it's I've had authors say it's your book, go for it. But I broke it down, and I think the fact that this is the last time all 4 Beatles walked into a studio to record a single, like they did in 1962 with with Love Me Do, and then for many great singles that didn't end up on albums.
Right.
This is the last time all four of them walked in just to record a single together.
Right.
So it's the end of an era. And
Right.
after that, the slog of the end of the White Album, and then obviously trying to get their stuff together for Get Back, the fights, the falling out, and then the Abbey Road to get one last thing. But even when they recorded Abbey Road, they knew it was over. I think there's some evidence now that it looked like they were still planning on another record, but we all know that things were fraying financially, emotionally between these guys. So you could look at Hey Jude as the final sunshine, like what the Beatles at the height of their powers, at the height of their popularity, and as close as they're going to be for the rest of their careers.
Now you said something interesting just now that I never really thought about. It is the last original single with all four of them, because the next original single, all the later singles were off of albums, which they never did much in the early days, and then at the end they just, let's grab one off of Abbey Road, and then Let It Be actually has 3 singles off of it, which is almost like Urset's greatest hits album in a certain
sure
respect.
is. And then you got the Ballad of John and Yoko, which is,
I was going to say Ballad of John and Yoko was original, but how Beatley is it? It's like, I always like the quote that George said about it, that he wasn't upset if he wasn't pictured on it or something. Well, it wasn't called the Ballad of John, George, and Yoko, so I wasn't too upset, or that he didn't play on it. It's like, so.
Right. So it is a demarcation, and thanks for noticing that, because it's one of the things that I struggled with. But I think once if you look at it, you could make a fair argument that Hey Jude is that last end of that amazing run. And then you have goodness, you have greatness in other cases, but it doesn't seem cohesive. It doesn't say, and also the na-na-nas and the yeah-yeah-yeahs from She Loves You. There's a lot of callback, to those halcyon days where they changed the world.
Yeah. And even though, the Beatles, or as solo artists, had single hit records that weren't on albums, it seemed like that kind of era in general was coming to a close. Of, you don't have a song just out there by itself. It has to be part of an album. I mean, granted, like I said, when they started their solo careers, Ringo just started off with singles, before he got into a proper rock and roll album. I'm not talking about Sentimental Journey or things like that, but and then both Paul and John put out just singles before they put out proper albums too. But maybe I'm out of the order on McCartney, because Another Day came out after McCartney, but anyway, right. But it wasn't an album. That's my point. But it seemed like I think the thing that your point was that it was the biggest selling single on Apple, and the first one. I never really thought about it that way. I said, surely there was like big records on Apple, and I was like going through them all, and I was like, well, Live and Let Die, well, maybe not. Imagine, maybe not, and I'm like going through it. My Sweet Lord, maybe not, and it's like, okay, I never really thought about it that way, that it was the best selling one,
and of any record label. So that would be like Columbia releasing the first song that Columbia ever released being their biggest song. Because nobody ever, like that's an amazing, coming right out of the chute. And you have to remember, this was a time when the Beatles kind of plateaued in their fame. They had what I think it's still underrated, and certainly ahead of its time. But the Magical Mystery Tour film kind of bombed, and Brian Epstein dies, and they're breaking off in different ways. They're getting married. They're moving out to the suburbs. They're going to see the Maharishi. There's a lot of things going on there. So in many ways, the Beatles kind of have plateaued, and this was a huge statement by them. Hey Jude, and it reestablished their dominance on the charts and as influencers in the world.
Because I think even the previous single of the last Capitol one, Lady Madonna, I don't think, did it not make it number one? Was it here or in England? One of the two places. I don't think it made it to number one.
Yeah, there's a couple of those, right? There was a couple of those that were number one in England, not number one here. That's why they always said, like, there's 20, like, for instance, Yesterday was never released as a single in Britain, so it was never number one, or in the UK. So I believe that there are 20, which is why they came out with 20 back in 2000, 2001, 20 number one hits by the Beatles in America. Yeah.
Right. So it's just interesting. Because it seemed like they were kind of struggling in '68 at the beginning of the year what to put out as a single. Lady Madonna took the nod, but I know Lennon was trying to get across the universe and never ever really succeeded in getting it out as a single. And I think Hey Bulldog was like too late for the running. And um, it's interesting that I think Lennon was having so much trouble. That's why they gave George the B-side with the Inner Light, just because it's like, I don't have anything.
Right.
So I don't know. It's an interesting time. The one thing I'm curious about, and we are kind of running out of time, but we'll come back to it once we rejoin. We have about
Sure.
2 minutes left. So, is was this song Hey Jude always designed the way it came out, meaning it was supposed to be the big 7 minute 45 second or whatever it is epic, or was it originally supposed to be like the first 3 minutes and then it evolved over time in your research?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. Paul wrote the song in about a day and a half. For my research, he went up to visit Julian and Cynthia on June 29th, 1968. He came back and he played it for John about a week later, the first week of July. He started playing it for other people. He played it for the guys in Badfinger. He played it at a pub. He played it for, different people, the Doodad Bonzo Band or so, so he played it for a few people. So we know these things because they told the stories and I put it in the book. So Paul basically wrote this song and structured it, worked on it with John, played with it. John came up with a beautiful harmony. But Paul says we kept going in the studio because we were having so much fun. And you could see it in the film. There was a film crew, I write about it in the book, that came to Abbey Road before they went to Trident and filmed them working it out. Just the three of them, because George had left either on his own accord or Paul kicked him out of the studio or something because he couldn't get it together for those guitar parts. And they're going over it. You could see if you listen to the outtake from the anthology, the outtake from the White Album box set, and you put those all together, you could see them getting longer and longer and longer. So it kind of developed over time. Yeah.
Very good. And we'll be back after this. Okay, we're back. And just wanted to just say one last thing about Hey Jude, and then kind of delve into your other books. We can still talk about the Beatles and everything, of course. And then it leads to a question. So I became a Beatles fan in 1977, and I've said my story before. I'll keep the short version. As I saw Eric Idle from Monty Python hosting Saturday Night Live, doing a outrageous version of Here Comes the Sun, where he's basically yelling and going, "Here comes the sun, and I say it's all right." It's like, I went to my parents and I said, what does the real song sound like? And so they had actually a copy of Abbey Road, and they go, well, we have the album over there. And oh, okay. And so I pulled it out and I played the song. I go, oh, I've heard this song before. And I flipped it over and then played Come Together. Then I played Something. And it's like, I heard Octopus's Garden on there. And it's like, I've heard all these songs. That's not right. You can't have all these songs on one record. And so that's how I became a fan. That was the first one I started at the end of the career and goes backwards. The only other thing my parents had was they had a copy of Help backed with I'm Down. So that was the extent of my record collection. And then slowly started getting things. I tended to buy singles more than albums. And I remember there used to be oldies that they would put in plastic in these little cardboard holders that were like long, that they just put a 7-inch single. And one of them had Hey Jude backed with Revolution with Big Apple on it. I said, ooh, an apple, because by 77, I think they had turned everything back to Capitol and stuff like that. So I was all excited. And then I was at this point starting to try to get everything, but it wasn't streamlined like it came out on CD later, where you could just buy 13 albums and you had everything. Now, you had to buy a single, and this song was over in this compilation, and this one was over here, and blah, 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 blah. And Hey Jude and Revolution were on the Hey Jude album, but I didn't know that at the time, and I figured it out later. But um, anyway, my point was, how did you first hear the song? I know you said you heard it as a youngster. Was that the first Beatles song you heard, or were you a Beatles fan already, or what
It would
made
have
you a
had to have
Beatles fan?
been. It would have
Okay.
had to have been. And I didn't, and that was no connection to the Beatles.
Okay.
None. It was
Okay.
just this melody. I was in love with melodies. You know, I used to watch these TV shows, Captain Kangaroo or the
Oh yeah.
Bozo show when I was a kid. This is pre Sesame Street. You know, Disney songs. My parents would get me Disney records.
Yeah.
You know, Mary Poppins, went to see that when I was a kid. Loved that musical. Oliver, I was taken to as a kid. So I was very connected to music. That was
Yeah.
my favorite thing. It's always
Yeah.
been my favorite thing. And so somehow I was 5 in '68. I was going to be six. And I was born in September. So it's towards the end.
Mhm.
And so somewhere along the line on the radio, and it was everywhere. So everybody I interviewed who was around at the time said it was, God, it was everywhere. So I must have heard it either, you know, coming out of a window or a store, and that those na-nas over and over again. You know how that connects to a kid, you know. So I just remembered it, sang it over and over again in my head, stuck in my head, which
Yeah.
Paul is great at. And then when I would have these nightmares, you know, and you call your parents in, and the first time they come in, they comfort you. The second time they kind of humor you, and by the third time they're like, just go to bed. And so I would just sing this over and over again
Yeah.
to get me to go to sleep. So I didn't know where it came from. Didn't know anything about it. I later,
Yes.
when I got a transistor radio, when I moved to Jersey when I was 10 years old, my father got me a transistor radio, and I started listening to pop radio, WABC here in New York.
Mhm.
And of course, they played Beatles stuff. A cousin Brucey was a Beatle guy. He was kind of like another fifth Beatle that followed them around, interviewed them, had him on the show when they came to America. So he was still on the radio then, and he would play, you know, Beatles songs almost every hour, at least one. So I started to hear the Beatles songs, and just like you just recognize them. So later on, when I got, like, you know, the Red and the Blue albums, I already knew most of those songs anyway,
Mhm.
and then discovered the albums later in high school and that kind
Right.
of thing. So my Beatle thing was gradual.
Yeah. Mine was too, if I really think about it, because I mean, the very first thing I ever heard to knowingly is like Yellow Submarine, but it wasn't even the Beatles version; it was the Muppets version on Sesame Street. So that's how I had
That's
determined that years later. So
right.
anyway, so besides Take a Sad Song, you've written at least two more books about music. One is Shout It Out Loud: The Story of Kiss's Destroyer album and the making of an American icon.
Yes.
And the other one is Accidentally Like a Martyr: Tortured Art of Warren Zevon. So you said you had a cool story before we got on the air here about the Kiss Destroyer album, the album cover and its artist. So
Yes.
I
So
would
I
like to
first
hear
of all,
it.
I was very excited to be on your show when I saw that you concentrate also on comic books. So this is the first time I've been on a show that had any kind of theme in that direction. Two things I want to say. I've said this once or twice before in interviews, and I always tell students when I speak at colleges or high schools or wherever, and that is the first book that inspired me to be a writer was Stan Lee's Origins of Marvel Comics.
Oh yeah.
I loved comic books when I was a kid, and it never occurred to me, and it seems odd, it never occurred to me that people were writing this. You know, when you're a kid, you think it just shows up. I mean, when I used to go to New York to visit my dad, who worked, you know, down this giant building on 57th Street, it was like going to Oz. I would look for Spider-Man. I'd be, where's Spider-Man? Spider-Man's in New York. He's down here somewhere. I mean, I was totally into the whole mythos of it. So when I got that book, I couldn't have been more than 11.
Yeah.
And and Stan Lee said something in there that totally sparked me. It said, you know, the greatest thing about writing is that it comes out of your head and ends up on somebody's nightstand at night. And it's like this amazing communication. It seemed like magic to me.
Mhm.
And so it made me want to be a writer. I used to write comic books with my friend Chris Pereira. We had our own comic book line that we used to sell the kids in the neighborhood in the 70s. And, you know, I wrote for the school newspaper. And I remember in my 8th grade yearbook, I wrote with, you know, they ask you what occupation. I said writer. So it was really came from that. So comics books were a big influence on me.
Mhm.
in the early days, and especially Stan. Um, so yeah, so the Kiss thing. So I decided to write this book about Kiss's Destroyer, and the main idea was to meet Bob Ezrin, who, if anybody loves comic books, you know that Bob worked with Alice Cooper for years, and he created these amazing albums that were like horror movies. They were like comic books.
Mhm.
And when he worked with Kiss, he did the same thing. He told these guys, look, you're not getting any themes out of these. All you're writing about is sex, drugs, rock and roll, women, but you're not, but you're the demon, you're the love child, you're the spaceman. You got to write songs that fire people's imagination. So when I heard that when I was 13, coming from a comic book background and loving Alice Cooper, so I wanted to write this book so I can find Bob, and I did. And I got to spend a lot of time with Bob and kind of pen pals now, which is great. But it never occurred to me, I realized writing the book how much that cover was so much like a comic book cover, and how
Mhm.
much I used to stare at it. And it made Kiss into superheroes. They were superhuman. It did what Bob Ezrin did on the vinyl. It was done on the cover. Turns out it was painted by a gentleman by the name of Ken Kelly.
Mhm.
And Ken was a comic book artist that wrote that. And I used to love those horror comics,
Yeah.
creepy and eerie and
Yeah.
weird
Yep.
and all that. And he did those. And there's a great story, two stories I'll tell you. The great story with Ken Kelly is that he was a starving artist. I dedicate a whole chapter to the cover. And I highly recommend anybody who's at all interested in what I'm saying to pick up the book and jump to that chapter, because it's just so much fun. He was a starving artist and he was barely making it. I think they got something like $75 for a cover. And
Mhm.
it would take him a week and a half to do it. And they painted these covers, by the way. It wasn't drawings, they were paintings.
Right.
And so he turns out he was the nephew or cousin of Frank Frazetta, who's the king of that stuff. Frank
Mhm.
Frazetta, famous for Vampira and Vampirella, excuse me, and Conan the Barbarian, and Kiss. Gene Simmons is a big comic book guy, and he wanted Frank Frazetta. So Dennis Wallach, who I interviewed for the book, was the cover designer. He did the designing for all the Kiss albums, and
Mhm.
he went out to get Frank Frazetta, and Frank Frazetta wanted not only like, I don't know, 20 grand for this thing. But that's like $150,000 in 1970 money. He wanted full rights to it. So Kiss couldn't put it on a t-shirt or a poster without him
Right.
getting money. And of course they couldn't do it.
Yeah.
So crestfallen, Dennis Wallach is walking out on 7th or 8th Avenue, right by where his office was. And he looks over, and staring at him from a newsstand is a cover of Eerie magazine. And I put this cover in my book, that Ken Kelly had painted with a robot, and there, you could just see the eyes of the robot. So the rest of the painting was just the scary robot, but the eyes had emotion, like they were sad, that there
Mhm.
was someone trapped by there. And he just thought that told the whole story in one painting. He picked up the magazine, came back, called, found Ken Kelly, and as Ken told me, it changed my life.
Yeah.
I became a much more famous artist. He did covers for Molly Hatchet. He did Kiss, another Kiss album, and it changed. It's amazing how he did it, how he painted this thing. They just gave him these little slides instead of pictures of Kiss, and
Eh,
he had his wife, pose. If you've ever seen the cover of that, on the
yeah. Yeah.
stairway, and he would take pictures of her because he wanted to make him coming down from a mountain. It's a beautiful story. And at the end of my interview, he said, I enjoyed this so much. It was great taking me back. I want to do something for you. So he mails me a hand-drawn version of that cover and writes, "Good luck with the book, Ken Kelly," which I have hanging in my living room now.
Wow.
It's in all the things I've done, writing books, meeting Bob Ezrin, meeting Alice Cooper, meeting all these people I've met over the years. That was the greatest thrill. And
Mhm.
just this past summer, Ken passed. We
Right.
stayed in touch. A sweeter man you'll never meet. And his story about how, on an ancillary level, he was a huge part of this massive culture that Kiss built up. Because the subtitle of my book is "The Making of American Icon," and I believe Destroyer and that painting made them more than a band. They
Yeah.
became a brand.
Yeah.
And a brand that, by the way, is still going now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's only two guys left in the band, but you know what I mean. The
Right.
painting, the
But
faces,
even when it was the four of them, yeah.
incredible
Um,
story. Yeah.
the interesting thing about that album, I was never the hugest Kiss fan, to be honest, but I had to double check just now. I was saying, what's the song listing on it? Excuse me. They had at least three iconic tracks on that, which is,
Yeah.
probably more than any of their other albums. It always seemed like they always had like one, maybe two, but they had Detroit Rock City. What am I thinking of? Beth, and then what was the other one?
The one I named the book, Shout It Out Loud.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, and then arguably there's others that, you know, are still as incredible,
Oh,
you
God
know,
of
that
Thunder, which is
yeah,
everybody knows that's
yeah,
Gene's song. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
that kind of.
So, you know, do you agree with that assessment that that's probably their best album?
Oh,
Or
by far.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think
okay.
it's I think it's their only great album. I am not,
Yeah,
I was a Kiss fan for, a couple of years when I was a kid. And I'm not one of those people who stopped listening to them and then trash them. I just didn't enjoy their other records as much. I
yeah,
like their earlier stuff because it's kind of raw. I loved Kiss Alive. I got it for my 8th grade graduation. I was
yeah,
fascinated by the whole thing. Just like I said before about Marvel Comics,
yeah,
and but to me, when that record came out, I was fully immersed in the idea. And it turns out it was as much a Bob Ezrin album as Kiss, because if you listen to The Wall or Peter Gabriel's first solo album or any of those Alice Cooper albums, you hear what you hear on Destroyer. And it's an amazing, and Bob took me behind the curtain. I made the joke that he was my Wizard of Oz. It took me a year to get him. But once he pulled me behind the curtain, he tells the stories of how he was able to paint making a cinematic film out of an album. Because back in the 70s, I talk about how we listened to records in the 70s. You were tethered.
yeah.
There was no Walkman, and there's this, and you were lucky if you had a tape deck in your car. You
Right.
just didn't. I mean, rich people did, but you didn't.
Yeah.
And you sat there with the record, and all you had was the cover and the headphones, and you went on these dreamscapes.
Yeah.
And nobody did that better than Ezra. So for him to build this whole world around these guys, and I'm not saying that Kiss wasn't a huge part of it, they were, but he was their Svengali. And then what they did was they ran back to other producers after that. So when they came out with records after that, to me, it paled.
Yeah.
To me, it's funny because I used, when I did interviews for this, Mark, I used this thing when the Beatles did Sgt. Pepper's, you had Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper. You could see the movement. And Dylan, when he had, he had his 3 albums that led up to the double album.
Blonde on Blonde.
Blonde on Blonde.
Yeah.
But you get nothing like that with Kiss.
Yeah.
It's like, it's this thing, Destroyer, and then the other stuff. So to me, yes, and it's their finest work. It's their finest work. Yeah. And it was fun to write about. Yeah.
At least the music supports the artwork. I mean, because
Agreed.
I would say an equivalency, which is not equivalency, but where the music pales and it has a great cover, but in a different way, is Kiss Unmasked, which I think is a very funny cover.
Yes.
It's where they're trying to get them to take off their makeup and everything like
yes,
that.
It's
Very
it's
corny.
like a comic book, literally a comic book. Yeah.
But the music is kind of not their
terrible.
best material,
terrible.
and I think they're about to break up at that point and stuff like that. They might have had one more album, I don't remember, but it's like just interesting. And I was never the hugest fan, but all my friends were, and so I became a fan just by I knew all the album titles, the Rock and Roll Over and Kiss Alive, and this, just because everybody else had them, and I knew all the songs that way.
People don't realize how huge they were. They were everywhere, and they had toys, and they had a movie, and they had a comic book. It was insane.
They had a comic book. They had a Marvel Super Special where they put their blood into it. I had that. And it's like they had a TV special that was kind of comic book-ish, and then they made appearances on
where they had superpowers. All that stuff comes from Ken Kelly. Ken Kelly invented that. Bob Ezrin and Ken Kelly, those two guys on the visual and the oral, AURAL, invented what you know as Kiss. I mean, Kiss had to do it first. They painted their faces and they came up with these characters, and they're brilliant for doing it. But to me, they end up being an oddity that people remember from the 70s, like a pet rock. They don't become this massive thing that's still touring, which is insane to think about.
And then there's some people that are still fans of the later stuff and everything like that. For me, it's just like, when they don't have all 4, it's the original guys. It just seems like it's a different band, especially when they weren't wearing their makeup for a number of years. It just was like, that's a different band. It's not even the same thing.
It's not the same thing, right? Yep.
But anyway, it was just kind of an interesting thing. I was just kind of curious about your assessment as well. So now the other one, Accidentally Like a Martyr, Tortured Art of Warren Zevon. Well, I'll say the inevitable thing everybody would probably say. I only know Warren Zevon from Werewolves
of London.
which is, I know him from one other thing, because I'm doing a book on the Turtles, and he wrote a couple of their songs. So
Yes, like a
yeah,
seasons, like the
yeah,
seasons, which is on the B side of Happy Together. Yeah.
yeah. So although he didn't use his real name on that on the original single, I think later it came out he was Warren Zevon.
Yes, you're right.
Yeah.
And it's funny because he and was it Howard Kalin, right? From the
Yes.
Turtles? Yeah.
Yep.
They were very, very close. When Warren didn't have any money at all, Kalin would buy him, get him a joint, buy him some tacos, get him through days, and always thought he was a brilliant songwriter. The thing that's so fascinating, and please, I don't mean to interrupt, you were going to ask a question, but the thing that always fascinated about Warren's career is that everybody around him thought he was completely mad, but also thought he was one of the greatest, if not best songwriters out of all of them. And I'm talking about Jackson Browne, Glenn Frey, Neil Young. They all were like this. We pale in comparison to this guy. Even later on, I don't think Bruce Springsteen thought this, but he was very impressed by Zevon, wrote a song with Zevon, always wanted to know what Warren was doing. And in the end, after Warren died, he does not only a representative version of one of his great songs, My Ride's Here, but I think actually a superlative, an actual better version than Warren's version of that song. Mm-hmm. So the songwriters knew how great he was. I mean, Howard Kalin knew when he was, wandering almost homeless around Hollywood, how great Warren Zevon was.
Mm-hmm. The only thing I can compare him to, and also because I know his career a little bit better, is Harry Nilsson.
That's a great comparison.
Yeah. Okay.
Although Harry Nilsson was a singer first, he was a great, great songwriter in the same vein as Randy Newman, whom he loved and did a whole record of his, of his work. Yeah. And Warren Zevon, people who do not write, they write novels, right? So Warren always said, why do I have to write love songs? Novelists get to write about, killer sharks or whatever. I have to write these songs. Now, obviously, other people were writing other types of songs for years. Frank Zappa made a whole career of that. Dylan obviously did. But, Warren took it to another level. And I always was so fascinated by him. And people always ask me, why did you write a book about Warren Zevon? I said, because not enough people know him, and they should. And the one thing I loved about writing that book, Mark, was that when I went on the book tour, I've never had this experience in all my time. I have 8 books published. I've never, ever had people come up to me and hug me and thank me for doing it. Yeah. They thanked me. They were like, thank you. Somebody needs to write. Because the only other book up until that point was his ex-wife, who I interview for my book, Crystal Zevon, who did a oral biography. And it was good, but she doesn't write about the music or anything like that. So I thought it needed to be done. And I got the full blessing of his son, Jordan, and everybody in the Zevon family. His uncles, cousins were calling me up out of nowhere and thanking me for doing it. And that was, like I said, with the Ken Kelly drawing that he sent me, that's the gift of writing a book like that, is that not enough people knew. So it's kind of my little crusade.
Yeah. And I have to admit, I'm not as versed about him as I probably should be, since I have actually quite an extensive music knowledge of various
what
artists.
You should do? You should listen to his first record, the first Asylum record, not the one he did with Kim Fowley, but the first one. The one he did with Fowley was Wanted Dead or Alive or whatever. That record is a masterpiece. It was produced by Jackson Browne. And you might have heard of Poor Pitiful Me. I'll Sleep When I'm Dead is on that record.
Yeah. It's like I was going to say, what other songs has he done?
Hasten Down the Wind, which Linda Ronstadt made famous. And it's Muhammad's Radio. There's one song after the other that just hits you right in the chin. I think I write in the book, he was an artist that would never blink. You think about you sitting across from someone and they're just staring at you and they're making you have an emotion, some reaction. That's what he did. He forced reactions out of his listeners. And as a writer, that's why Stephen King and Carl Hyacin and Hunter S. Thompson and Dave Barry, the list is long. Mitch Albom, they worship this guy. Right. Because writers come to people who do that, who write narratives and write arcs and stories. And nobody did that, in my estimation, better than Warren.
Mm-hmm. Now, I do have to ask this just because. Is Kid Rock a fan?
Oh, geez. Yeah. It's funny. I was at LBI, where Long Beach Island here in Jersey, go every year with my family. and we were by the pool, and they were playing music at the hotel next door on the beach or something, and I hadn't heard him doing, I guess, the Neil Young song into the Leonard Skinner song into Werewolves of London, back to Leonard Skinner. I'm like, what the? Where have I been, under a rock? I didn't even put it in my book. I have no idea. I mean, we all grew up. Everyone knows that song, and it's Halloween, so
Yeah.
yeah.
It's funny though, because I pointed out, I said, hey, it's Sweet Home Alabama and Werewolves of London. A lot of people can't tell that Werewolves of London, and look, no, it switches. The songs switch. It's not, he's not sampling just one song, he's sampling multiple songs. So it's like,
Right,
oh,
right.
So anyway, I noticed it right away, but that's just because
Sure.
Werewolves of London, arguably was an immense hit for him. Even if it didn't top the charts, it was
I think
played
it made it to like number 16 or 15, which is
yeah.
insanely high for him. Warren always said, I'm a folk singer that stumbled into a pop singer for a few months. And I remember when I was pitching the book, well, originally when I was sitting down with the PR department, I said, listen, this is going to be a tough one. The Kiss book did so well that they not allowed me, but it was easy to pitch an idea. Like, not a lot of people are probably going to buy this.
Yeah.
But I said, you have to remember, this is a man who died at that time. I don't remember. The book came out in 2018. So he had been dead for 15 years. He's been dead for 15 years.
Wow.
He was famous for 8 months, 35 years ago. Yeah. And so this is going to be a tough pitch for everybody here to get people, but he, it's funny. He was, David Letterman, as you know, adored him.
Yeah.
And if you don't know, that's a famous story, that Letterman always had him on when nobody cared about him. He was kicked off his label and everything. He was a very bad alcoholic.
Yep.
And he would sit in sometimes as the band leader and all that stuff. And when he contracted an inoperable lung cancer, and later on mesothelioma, which they diagnosed, he only did one show. He did, a few months before he died, he played. Letterman dedicated an entire hour. You can see it on YouTube. It's moving as hell. I write about it in the book. He could barely shuffle his way up to the piano, but he played 3 songs for David. And then I interviewed the gentleman from Dawes. His name escapes me now. I'm so sorry. But he had played, Dawes had played Letterman's last week before he retired, and he begged them to play not accidentally like more, the last song on that first record, Desperados Under the Eaves, which is my favorite Warren Zevon song. And I start my book with that, an essay about that song. And he told me Dave was weeping. And they were so close. And when David Letterman inducted Pearl Jam into the Rock and Roll of Fame, he said Warren Zevon better be inducted next year. And of course, he still hasn't. But yeah, he's been on a crusade for years to get Warren in the. So there were people who just continued to celebrate his career, even though, like you said, after Werewolves, people just like, who is this again? Yeah, that guy's still making music. You know what I mean? There were still people out there, ringing the bell for him. Yeah.
Right. It's just interesting. But the people who know that song, at least, they always know, his hair was perfect.
His hair was perfect. Yeah.
And he's having a pina colada at Trader Vic's.
Trader Vic's. And you know what? Martin Scorsese, who Warren loved, dedicated 2 albums to. Scorsese loved Warren's work and put Werewolves of London in Color of Money, and that saved Warren in a very, very dark time. There were a lot of dark times for Warren. I met a lot of people around him, and they sort of, and his son, like I said, Jordan and other people, they rooted me to finish the book because Warren is such a dark character and had such a dark life, such a troubled life, was such a mercurial figure. And then when he finally cleans up and he's in the best shape of his life, he contracts this cancer, and then he writes a whole record called The Wind about dying.
Yeah,
which later on became fashionable. Johnny Cash did it, David Bowie did it, but he, as far as I could tell, he did it first. And it was so hard for me to get through that book. But once I was done, I looked back at the full scope of this man's life, and I realized how much he put in his work. where everybody who his daughter told me, his daughter Ariel, you know more about my father than I do. There's more about him in these songs than we ever knew about him. So, and that's sad to hear. I hope my daughter doesn't say about that, that you know more about me through my books than being a father. But like I said, he was a very troubled character, Warren. It was tough to write about him. But I was very glad that people loved the fact that I did take the time to do it. And his songs are wonderful. Please go, if you have Spotify or something, go through his canon. He's even his later stuff when he's just playing in his living room because he can't afford to get a studio or a band. That stuff's just great. Yeah.
I'll probably like him because, like I said, if he's similar to Nielsen, or what's another one? Well, you mentioned Randy Newman. Is he kind of similar to him in a certain respect?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, Randy Newman's one of my all-time favorite artists. Okay. Yeah. So,
of course, he's still with us, fortunately.
Yes.
Out of all these.
Nominated for 40 Oscars and he won one.
Yay. What was I going to ask? Are all these, at least these music ones, the Kiss one, the Warren Zevon one, are they also from Backbeat as well? Or?
Yes, all three for Backbeat. Okay. They are available everywhere. You get them on Amazon, whatever. If anybody is still with us and they're listening to the podcast and, they're enjoying our discussion, if you want a signed book, I will sign it directly to people. If you live in the continental USA, I will mail it to you free on jamescampion.com. All of my books are on there. Okay. I will sign it to a friend, to you, whatever, and mail it out to you for free. Okay. Yeah.
And then I just wanted to touch on some of the other books. It looks like mainly your other ones are like articles and essays you've written for other publications, just kind of compilations. Am I right or wrong?
Yeah, I have two compilations. My first published book from 1996 was a book called Deep Tank Jersey. Okay. And it was about a New Jersey club band. I wanted to write a band that wasn't famous, but made tons of money playing cover material. The Jersey circuit is very, very unique. When I did a book tour for that, I went to places like Boston, I went to Philly, and they couldn't believe that you could get 3,000 people to show up to a club to see people play, Nirvana songs or something like that. And there's a movement. That's where Springsteen came from. That's where Bon Jovi came from, Southside Johnny. That circuit is still, it's not quite the same now. I think I caught it at the very end of the circuit the way it was in 1995. Of course, you can't do any of the things you used to be able to do in bars, rock and roll bands, and they're all in there. It's very sordid and crazy, but I wanted to do that. So that was my first published book. And then there's a couple, after that, I did a couple of compendiums of essays and columns that I wrote called Fear No Art. And the other one was called Midnight for Cinderella. And in between that, I wrote a book about the historical Jesus when I went to Israel for a month during the elections.
Wow. Okay, I saw that. Trailing Jesus.
Trailing Jesus, yeah.
Okay. And then there's one called just the letter Y. What is that?
Yes. Well, you might like this book, Mark. Maybe I got to get you a copy of this. I'll tell you why, because if you like comic books, it was my attempt. Why? Exactly. It was my attempt to do Lewis Carroll. I tried to take the mathematical concepts of Carroll's Through the Looking Glass and Alice in Wonderland and create an adult version. By adult, I don't mean an X-rated version. I mean a version in which Alice is me and the Wonderland is New York City, because I've always believed, working for independent weeklies and underground newspapers and art papers in around New York, there are places in New York people don't know exist. They're real, but there's a mythos about it. Like these underground places like that are in old abandoned shafts or subway places, but they exist. And I thought I had covered them over the years. And so I thought I'd like to write, it's my only novel, it's my only work of fiction, but some of the stories in that, I'd say most of the stories in it are from my experience as a freelancer running around New York and all the interesting characters I met that were artists, or at least they thought they were artists or whatever. And I posed the question in the book, what is art?
Yeah.
What, there's highbrow, lowbrow, whatever, but what constitutes art? And it's an argument that my wife and I have had many, many times. The last real blowout we had was in Paris, which was great. We were in Paris discussing art. And I'll ask you, Mark, let me ask you this. Do you think, I feel that art is a two-way street. I do something, you react to it. Until my book gets out and is read and people tell me, I hate this, I love this, I cried, I laughed, whatever. It's not art. It's creative. I created it. My wife thinks if you make 50 paintings and you put them in the basement, they are still art, even if no one sees them. I think they're creations, but to me, the definition of art is I make it, it's a two-way street. I make it, you react to it. I make a film, you watch it. I scare you, I seduce you, I make you cry, whatever. I make a song, you sing it, whatever. I think it's a two-way street. What do you think?
I think both could be art, and I'm not saying it as a cop out, but it's like it's a different level. It's almost like the word love or the word hand or whatever. That there's multiple meanings for the same word. I
Right.
mean, because I get what you're saying is like if you're not communicating with anybody, how could that be art? But if you're just drawing a picture for yourself, well, it's still a picture, so that could be art too, but it's probably not the same type of art, so that's
Right.
my cop out answer. That
No, that's a
you know,
good answer. I mean,
uh,
the tree falls in the woods, does it make a sound? No one hears it, does it make a sound?
yeah,
There's to me, that's why I always call writing a craft
yeah,
more than art, because whenever I'm working on a book, the editors always tell me, make sure the reader understands this. This is easier to read. You probably want to take this part out because you're getting off the track for I'm constantly writing to be read. So
yeah,
that's my experience as a quote
yeah.
unquote artist, if you will. Yeah.
All right, very cool. Well, we're running out of time again. We got about 5 minutes, and I just wanted
Sure.
to let you. You've already kind of started the plug phase, but uh,
Thank
just
you.
plug every book again. If you just want to plug Hey Jude, you can. But tell them where they can get those books, and if you're making any personal appearances, how they can get in contact with you, things like that.
Yeah, everything's through jamescampion.com. You can find my books everywhere. Just Google me. I'll come up. Go to Amazon, type my name in, James Campion. You'll find all my books. I don't know when this is coming out, but on November 16th, there's a very special event going on at Rockwood Music Hall in New York City. Do you live in the New York area, Mark?
No, I'm in Oregon. I'm way far away.
Oh, okay. All right. So we're having an event. Rob Sheffield from Rolling Stone magazine,
Oh, cool.
of Dreaming the Beatles fame and Life is a Mixtape. And he wrote a wonderful book about Bowie. He's going to sit on a panel with me, my good friend Adam Duritz from Counting Crows. He and I are working on a book together. We did a podcast together for years that got stopped during the pandemic called Underwater Sunshine. And we co-host a music festival in New York, which is happening the 18th and 19th. So that Wednesday, we're doing a panel discussion on my book. And Rob, who's in it, Stephen Kellogg, one of the songwriters, Matt Susage, one of the songwriters, everybody that was in a lot of people that were in my book are going to have a panel discussion on the Beatles, Hey Jude, songwriting. So if this is out before the 16th and you happen to be in the New York area, it's between 7:30 and 9. It's free to get in, just RSVP at Rockwood Music Hall. It's on the Lower East Side, right by Katz's Deli, where the famous Harry Met Sally, I'll have what she's having, was filmed. And so I'm really looking forward to that. But we're really wrapping up the book tour. Doing these podcasts have been great. Thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun. I enjoyed your show. I want to thank Lori Jacobson for getting us together. I enjoyed your discussion with Lori and her wonderful book about the Shea Stadium book. But thank you so much again. And if anybody's interested, again, I will sign books at jamescampion.com and mail them out for free.
Okay, I will definitely get this. I can shuffle the order of my shows, so I can definitely get this up before the 16th of
Oh,
November.
thank you, man.
So,
Appreciate that.
so,
Appreciate it. Where in Oregon are you before we?
I'm in Springfield, Oregon, right dead center. It's where the home of the Simpsons are.
Oh,
Seriously.
yeah, Springfield. Yeah, that's right. Right. Did they figure out that there's a Springfield in every state?
Yeah,
right?
but Matt Groening actually said about 10 years ago, it really is. There is a mural downtown. Of course, now there's a bunch of knockoff graffiti art that looks pretty good around town and everything. So yeah, you can see.
Congratulations. The Simpsons are one of my favorite pieces of, entertainment ever created in America.
And then we're back to back with Eugene, and Eugene is where they filmed National Lampoon's Animal House. And
that's the comedy center of America, apparently.
Yeah. And so, we got other things that happened in Oregon. They filmed One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest up here. They filmed The General by Buster Keaton up here. Bunch of other stuff. Goonies, things like that. So anyway.
Well, if you ever get to New York, look me up. We'll go to some literary bars.
I've been to New York about 3 times, but I haven't been since about 2009, so I'm overdue. So
all right. Very good. Well, it's very nice meeting you. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I really do enjoy the show. I'm looking forward to hearing my appearance, but really keep up the fine work. I enjoy it.
And we'll keep in touch, and let me know what next book project you're working on. I'll probably want that one too.
Yeah,
So,
I haven't really I haven't revealed it yet because I need the people that I want to write about to be on board.
of course.
And so so when I do find that out, I'll discuss it. But it's a go. I mean, Backbeat said I could do it, and I'm still working on that book with Adam Duritz that we ended up doing the podcast, but working on a book about his songwriting and performance. How he does it. I wanted to get inside and spend time with an artist of his magnitude, and he's become a good friend. So we're hoping in the next couple of years that will be done and out.
All right. Well, I guess that wraps it up. And I want to thank you, James Campion, for being my special guest. I love all your book ideas and the
Thank you, man.
things. I have to get the copies of all these things,
Aw,
especially the Warren Zevon one. Anyway, and that wraps it up for another Fun Ideas podcast. And we will see you next time.
peace.